Hi, my name is Ellis Jones. I'm a professor of sociology at Holy Cross College. I study ethical consumerism. This is my response to Slavoj Zizek's recent talk on the ethics of consumption and its relation to cultural capitalism. I have 6 points I want to explain in light of Zizek's argument. The first is Zizek takes this idea of the consumer and the anti-consumer, and he wants to argue that we have conflated the two ideas, that at first we had the consumer who was bad and then the anti-consumer who was good, because the anti-consumer was basically environmentalist trying to consume less, but now we've merged the two together and we have this kind of hybrid Frankenstein. I argue that it's an oversimplification to talk about a consumer versus an anti-consumer. What we have is a problem that involves both quantity and quality. The quantity and quality of consumption. Now, the quantity of consumption is something that the simple living movement, the voluntary simplicity folks have discussed in length, and environmentalists understand, for example, that because our society, our global society at this point, suffers from hyperconsumption, a necessary component to the solution is to reduce the amount or the quantity of consumption. However, there is an additional problem, and that is the quality problem. We also, at the very same time that we reduce the quantity of consumption, need to increase the quality of consumption for a couple of reasons. First, we can't reduce our quantity of consumption to nothing. It's impossible. There's no way to convince people to lower their living standards to asceticism. It's not going to happen. We do need to reduce the quantity, but at the very same time, the consumption that we all engage in, however small in quantity, needs to have a much more positive impact on all kinds of things, everything from the environment to human rights, social justice issues, animal protection, community, etc. We need to increase the way those economic impacts manifest in the world. So what we have is a problem which we need the new consumer to both be an anti-consumer and a high-quality consumer. Quality, again, in terms of all of these social and environmental issues. The second point that Zizek raises is about Starbucks. He uses this example of Starbucks over and over again, talks about how Starbucks has you buy into a whole schema of ethics. Now, a couple of things right off the bat. Starbucks is overall, in the world of successful mega corporations, it's actually kind of a good company. This is what I've worked on for the past decade or so. And an A to F scale with Starbucks always runs around a B. And that means that all the other mega corporations that are generating coffee in this world are doing it with much worse overall impact to human beings and the environment. Having said that, Starbucks is not as good, or a significant cut below, these smaller fair trade coffee companies in particular, smaller independent little coffee companies that have a lot more integrity around their organics and their purchasing and their small farmer cooperatives and all of that. And so it's important to understand that Starbucks is not the ultimate representation of ethical consumers' options in the area, so that we're not painting everybody with the same brush. Having said that, again, Starbucks is decent and, in fact, fairly good for a mega company. Now, part of the problem is that Starbucks and most other particularly large and successful companies, when playing the CSR game, the corporate social responsibility game, there are currently no rules. So since no one is checking the books on CSR, it means that companies tend to combine their CSR work with their PR work, or public relations work, and thus we get these campaigns in which kind of fantasies are woven for us as consumers so that we will buy in, like we do with regular advertising, to this ethical component. So Starbucks, I think, like almost every other corporation, completely overstates its case and tries to convince the consumer that they're having far more of an impact than they are actually having by buying Starbucks coffee. Having said that, they're not the worst of the worst. They're not lying through their teeth like some corporations. And thus, we should be somewhat forgiving, although, again, we probably need transparency and accountability and integrity to be injected throughout the system if we're going to get it to move forward. The third point that I'd like to take with Zizek is this idea of cultural capitalism, where he argues that we are ultimately trying to purchase our own redemption through consumption, that we're trying to buy off our guilty conscience. This is a classic problem for ethical consumerism, as it is for, in some ways, many related, particularly lifestyle activist related movements. And that is that what do you do about armchair activists? What do you do about the person who recycles a tin can and then says, I'm a good person and I don't need to do anything else? Recycling is not enough. Purchasing a Starbucks is not enough. It may not even be, it may just barely be a start. So I understand the critique that if people stop with this idea of, I bought a few ethically purchased goods, now the world is going to be a better place. That's not going to happen. It's not real. I don't think most people stop there. I think they use it as an arm or a tool in their toolbox for trying to move things forward, to make things right in the world, to be a good person in the world, and this is just another tool. I don't think we're really buying ourselves redemption. The fourth point Zizek makes is about Tom's shoes, which he uses, this company, he uses as the ultimate example of cultural capitalism. Now, granted, on the downside, Tom Shoes buys into a kind of philanthropic model, which I have many problems with, and which is in many ways a charity model, which we'll talk about a little more in a second, which can be problematic. And yet, because we are at the early stage of ethical consumerism, I really admire small companies that are out there trying to push the envelope. I think Tom Shoes does a good job. By the way, if you're not familiar, you buy a pair of shoes, and when you purchase those shoes, another pair of shoes is given to somebody in the global south, in the developing world. And thus, you have a connection with your purchase. You are connected directly to another human being in the world, whether or not the actual shoes are effective to give, in this other country to whoever it is that they're given to. The idea is innovative, it's thoughtful, and I think it brings human beings to a place that they need to be as consumers, which is to begin to think about those global connections, to think about the way in which their purchase is actually connected to impacts all over the world, impacts in human beings abroad. And thus, Tom Shoes, I think, is doing some really interesting and important work. So not probably the company that I would use to talk about as the pinnacle of a problem. My fifth point comes around Zizek's example of organic apples, in which he basically reduces the idea of the ultimate impact of purchasing something like an organic apple as purchasing a warm fuzzy feeling. Now, while you probably do get at some level a warm fuzzy feeling, in some ways that may also be partially rebalanced by the fact that you're having to pay more out of pocket, so it hurts a little bit more to pay more for goods at the same time. However, having said that, the basic problem I have with this is that ultimately when you purchase organic items, despite the fact that the label has been watered down, it's been exploited by large corporations, it's very problematic, ultimately organic still, the average organic item is having a more positive impact than the average non-organic version of that item.